They told him the island was worthless. But they never told him why the German shepherd refused to leave. Ethan Caldwell heard those words only after the papers were signed. By then, it was already too late to change his mind. The island was his. A small piece of land surrounded by cold blue water, nearly forgotten by the world, and considered impossible to sell by everyone who knew its history. Most people saw an abandoned island with an empty house, broken docks, and years of silence. Ethan saw something different. He saw a place where he could finally breathe. After 30 years of service as a United States Marine, Ethan had spent his life moving from one mission to another. He knew how to follow orders, how to protect others, and how to keep going when things became difficult. But after retirement, the quiet felt heavier than he expected. The days became longer. The purpose he once carried so naturally seemed harder to find. So when he discovered the island for sale at a price that seemed almost unbelievable, he made a decision. He would leave the noise behind and start again. The real estate agent had looked at him carefully before handing over the final documents. Most buyers walk away after hearing the stories, she said. Ethan had asked what story she meant. She only looked toward the window, where the ocean stretched endlessly beyond the town. People used to live there, she whispered. Then one day, they stopped coming back. Ethan did not believe in rumors. He had spent enough years in the military to know that fear could grow faster than facts. He was not searching for a perfect place. He was searching for a quiet one. And he would not be going alone. Sitting beside him on the small boat crossing toward the island was Ranger, his 5-year-old German shepherd. Ranger had been with Ethan through some of the hardest transitions of his life. The dog had a calm presence that never demanded attention, but always seemed to know when Ethan needed company. As the boat moved closer to the shore, the island appeared almost frozen in time. Tall trees covered parts of the land. The old wooden house stood near the center, weathered by years of ocean air. The dock looked tired, but still strong enough to welcome them home. Ethan stepped onto the island carrying only a few bags and a lifetime of memories. Ranger followed slowly, his paws touching the old wooden boards. For a moment, everything was peaceful. The sound of waves, the movement of the wind through the trees, the distant call of birds above the water. Ethan felt something he had not felt in years, a small sense of possibility. But Ranger noticed something else. While Ethan focused on the house, the German shepherd turned toward the edge of the property. His ears lifted. His eyes stayed fixed on a section of trees near the shoreline. Ethan noticed and smiled. "What did you find, buddy?" he asked quietly. Ranger did not move. He simply stood there, watching a place where nothing seemed unusual. Later that afternoon, Ethan explored the island. He opened the old house and discovered rooms covered in dust but filled with signs of a life that had once existed there. A faded photograph on the wall, an old wooden table, a journal left inside a drawer. The island was not empty. It was only waiting. As the sun began to disappear beyond the horizon, Ethan sat outside with Ranger beside him. The silence felt different now. It was not lonely. It felt like the beginning of a story he had not expected to find. But just before night settled over the island, Ranger suddenly stood up and walked toward the old trees again. This time, Ethan followed. Hidden beneath the leaves was something neither of them had noticed before. A narrow path leading deeper into the island. And at the end of that path was a door that looked like it had been waiting for someone to open it. The door at the end of the hidden path looked like it had been waiting for decades. Ethan Caldwell stood in front of it with Ranger beside him, listening to the quiet sound of the ocean behind the trees. The island had only been his for one day, yet it already felt like it was revealing pieces of a story that had been forgotten. He reached for the old handle and gently pushed. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a small room built into the side of the hill. Inside, there was no treasure, no expensive collection, and nothing that explained why people had abandoned the island. Instead, Ethan found something much more personal. The room contained old shelves, wooden boxes, and carefully stored belongings from the people who had once called this place home. A faded blanket rested on a chair. Several books sat neatly on a table. A collection of handwritten notes was tied together with a simple piece of string. Ranger walked slowly through the room, stopping near each item as if he was trying to understand the memories surrounding them. Ethan picked up one of the notes and noticed a date written at the top. It was from more than 20 years earlier. The message was short, but the words carried emotion. It spoke about the island being a place where people came to find peace, recover from difficult seasons, and remember what truly mattered. Ethan sat quietly for a moment. After years of serving in the Marines, he understood the importance of having a place where people could feel safe and connected. He continued searching through the room and discovered a small collection of photographs. They showed families standing near the same old house he had just entered, children running along the shoreline, friends gathering around the wooden dock, people smiling beneath the island's sun. The island had not always been empty. It had once been full of life. Later that evening, Ethan returned to the main house carrying the photographs and notes. He placed them on the old kitchen table and studied them under the soft glow of a lantern. Something about the island was becoming clear. The stories he heard from the mainland were incomplete. People said nobody lived here anymore, but they never explained why. Ethan wanted to understand. The next morning, he explored more of the property with Ranger. The German shepherd moved ahead, but never far away. He checked the paths, looked around the old buildings, and occasionally stopped as if listening to something Ethan could not hear. Near the back of the island, Ranger discovered another unusual place. It was a small garden hidden behind tall trees. Unlike the rest of the property, this area had been carefully maintained long ago. In the center stood a stone bench covered with moss. Ethan brushed away the leaves and found a small metal plate attached to the stone. The words were simple: "For those who need a place to begin again." Ethan read the message several times. Those words felt familiar. He knew what it meant to search for a new beginning. He had spent years protecting others, but after retirement, he had not known where he belonged. Maybe that was why the island had caught his attention. Maybe he was not just looking for a place to live. Maybe he was looking for a place to heal. That evening, Ethan sat near the shoreline with Ranger beside him. The waves moved gently against the rocks, and the island no longer felt abandoned. It felt like a place holding its breath. But as the moon rose above the water, Ranger suddenly turned toward the old house. The German shepherd stood still, focused on one of the windows. Ethan followed his gaze and noticed something strange. A small light appeared inside a room that had no electricity. He slowly stood up. The island had revealed another secret. And this time, Ranger had found it before anyone else. The small light inside the old house disappeared the moment Ethan Caldwell reached the front steps. He stood there for a few seconds, looking through the window, trying to understand what he had seen. The island had no electricity. The house had been untouched for years. Yet something had moved inside that forgotten place. Ranger stood beside him, calm and focused, watching the same window. Ethan placed his hand gently on the old door and opened it slowly. The inside of the house was exactly as he had left it. The dusty furniture, the old wooden floors, the quiet rooms filled with memories from another time. There was no one there. But near the hallway, Ethan noticed something different. A small lantern rested on a table. It was old, but recently cleaned. Next to it was a handwritten note. Ethan picked it up carefully. The message contained only a few words. "Some stories wait for the right person to return." Ethan read the sentence again. He did not know who wrote it or why it was left there. But he felt something he had not felt in years. A quiet connection to a place he had only just discovered. The next morning, Ethan decided to learn everything he could about the island's past. He returned to the hidden room beneath the trees and carefully organized the photographs and notes he had found. Ranger stayed close, resting near the doorway while Ethan searched through the old belongings. Among the papers, he found a journal belonging to a man named Samuel Whitaker. The journal described the island during its most peaceful years. Samuel wrote about neighbors helping each other, families gathering near the shore, and veterans finding comfort after returning from service. Ethan paused when he read those words. He understood the feeling behind them. He knew what it meant to leave one chapter behind and wonder what came next. The journal explained that the island had once been known as a place of second chances. People came there when they needed a quiet place to rebuild their lives. It was never meant to be a vacation destination. It was meant to be a place where people remembered they were not alone. As Ethan continued reading, he found several pages that seemed different from the others. Samuel wrote about a promise made many years earlier. He mentioned that the island's purpose could only continue if someone cared enough to protect it. Ethan looked around the small room. The words felt strangely personal. He had bought the island because he wanted to disappear from the world for a while. But the more he learned, the more he felt like the island was asking him to become part of its story. Later that afternoon, Ethan walked along the shoreline with Ranger. The German shepherd moved quietly beside him, occasionally stopping to look toward the water. Near the edge of the beach, Ranger stopped again. This time, he found something partially covered by sand. Ethan moved closer and discovered an old metal container. Inside were several letters wrapped carefully in waterproof material. The first letter was dated 30 years earlier. It was written by someone who had lived on the island and was addressed to a future owner. Ethan opened it slowly. The writer explained that the island was never abandoned. Because it failed. It was left behind because the people who cared for it believed someone would eventually come who understood its purpose. Ethan lowered the letter and looked out at the ocean. The thought stayed with him. Someone had expected another person to arrive. Someone had believed the island's story was not finished. That evening, Ethan sat outside the old house with Ranger beside him. The sky turned orange above the water, and the island felt less like a forgotten place and more like a message waiting to be understood. But before heading inside, Ranger stood and walked toward the northern side of the property. Ethan followed him through the trees until they reached a small wooden structure hidden from view. The door was closed, but unlike the others, it looked carefully preserved. On the front was a single word carved into the wood. Remember. Ethan placed his hand on the door. He knew the island had another story to tell, and this time, he was ready to listen. The wooden structure hidden among the trees stood quietly beneath the morning sky. Ethan Caldwell had seen many unusual things since arriving on the island, but this small building felt different. It was not forgotten. It was waiting. The word carved into the door stayed in his mind. Remember. He placed his hand on the old wood and slowly opened it. Inside was a simple room with shelves along the walls and a small desk near the window. Unlike the other places he had discovered, this room felt organized. Someone had taken care of it. Someone had wanted it preserved. Ranger entered first, moving calmly through the space. The German shepherd looked around before settling near the desk, as if he knew Ethan needed time to understand what he had found. On the desk was a leather notebook and a collection of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Ethan opened the notebook and discovered it belonged to Samuel Whitaker, the same person whose journal had revealed the island's history. But this notebook contained something different. It was not about daily life on the island. It was about the people who came there searching for a new beginning. Samuel wrote about veterans who struggled after leaving the military, families who needed a peaceful place to reconnect, and individuals who simply needed somewhere to remember who they were. Ethan slowly turned each page. The words felt familiar. He knew what it was like to spend years serving others, and then suddenly find himself asking what came next. The island was beginning to feel less like a purchase and more like a responsibility. Near the final pages, Samuel described why the island became empty. The truth was not what people on the mainland believed. There was no disaster, no terrible secret. The island had simply lost the person who carried its mission forward. After Samuel became older, he could no longer maintain everything alone. One by one, the people who depended on the island found other places to go. The buildings became quiet. The gardens grew wild. The memories remained, but the purpose slowly disappeared. Ethan looked around the room. He realized the island had not been abandoned because people stopped caring. It had been waiting because nobody knew who would continue the work. Inside the letters, Ethan found messages from people who had once visited the island. Each one described the same feeling. They did not remember the size of the house or the beauty of the shoreline. They remembered how the island made them feel. They remembered being welcomed. They remembered finding hope. One letter caught Ethan's attention. It was written by a former Marine who had stayed on the island many years earlier. The writer explained that the island gave him something he thought he had lost forever, a sense of belonging. Ethan read the sentence several times. He looked at Ranger resting beside him and felt a quiet understanding. Maybe that was why this place had drawn him here. Maybe he was not searching for an escape. Maybe he was searching for connection. Later that afternoon, Ethan explored the rest of the property with new eyes. The old buildings were not empty anymore. They were reminders. Every path, every room, and every forgotten object carried a piece of someone's life. Ranger walked ahead through the garden, occasionally stopping as if checking that Ethan was following. Near the center of the island, the German shepherd stopped beside a large tree. Beneath the branches was a small wooden box protected from the weather. Ethan opened it carefully and found a collection of names written on a single sheet of paper. At the top were 4 words. The people who mattered. Ethan stood silently, reading the names. They were not famous people. They were not wealthy people. They were ordinary individuals whose lives had crossed paths with this island. And that was when Ethan finally understood. The island's greatest secret was not hidden treasure or forgotten wealth. It was the reminder that every person leaves something behind. Some leave buildings. Some leave memories. Some leave kindness that continues long after they are gone. As the sun began to set, Ethan returned to the old house with Ranger beside him. He carried the notebook carefully in his hands. The island had answered one question, but another remained. Why had he been the one to find it? And what would he choose to do with the story now placed in his hands? The question stayed with Ethan Caldwell long after the sun disappeared behind the ocean. Why him? Why had he been the one to find the island, the journals, and the forgotten stories hidden within its quiet corners? He sat on the porch of the old house with Ranger beside him, listening to the waves move gently against the shore. For the first time in many years, Ethan felt like he was not searching for an answer. He was waiting for one to reveal itself. The next morning, Ethan returned to the small wooden building beneath the trees. He carried Samuel Whitaker's notebook with him, hoping to understand more about the promise that had been left behind. Ranger followed closely, his calm steps moving through the grass-covered path. Inside the room, Ethan continued examining the letters stored in the old wooden box. Among them, he found one envelope that looked different from the others. It had no name written on the front, only 2 words. For tomorrow. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside was a letter written decades earlier. The message was not addressed to a family member or a friend. It was written for whoever discovered the island after Samuel was gone. The letter explained that the island was never meant to belong to one person. It was meant to serve many people. Samuel wrote that the true value of the land was never measured by its location or its beauty. Its value came from the moments created there. He described evenings when strangers became friends, mornings when people found new hope, and quiet conversations that helped people begin again. Ethan read the letter slowly. Each sentence reminded him of the reasons he had served in the military. The uniform had been removed years earlier, but the desire to help others had never disappeared. He had simply forgotten where to place it. As he continued reading, Ethan found something that changed the way he viewed the island. Samuel had not purchased the land because it was valuable. He had purchased it because he believed everyone deserved a place where they could start over. The island was not a retreat from the world. It was a bridge back to it. Ethan looked around the room. The answer was becoming clearer. He had not found the island by accident. He had found it because he understood what it meant to search for a new beginning. Later that afternoon, Ethan walked along the shoreline with Ranger. The German shepherd moved beside him as the ocean breeze passed through the trees. They reached the old dock where the boat had first arrived. Ethan looked back at the island and noticed something he had missed before. The abandoned buildings were not signs of failure. They were signs of unfinished work. The island still had a purpose. It was simply waiting for someone willing to continue it. That evening, Ethan returned to the main house and began organizing everything he had discovered. He created separate folders for the photographs, letters, and historical records. He wanted to protect the stories before making any decisions about the future. While moving the old items, Ranger suddenly stopped near the fireplace. The dog looked toward a small section of the wall covered by an old wooden frame. Ethan approached and noticed a small mark carved into the surface. It looked like a symbol he had seen before. He carefully moved the frame and discovered another hidden compartment. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photograph showed Samuel standing beside a younger Marine outside the island house. Ethan recognized the uniform style immediately. It was from a generation before his own, but something about the person in the picture felt familiar. He turned the photograph over and found a name written on the back. His own family name. Ethan stood completely still. The island was no longer just connected to strangers from the past. It was connected to him. Ranger sat quietly beside him as Ethan held the photograph in his hands. The mystery had changed. He was no longer asking why nobody lived on the island. Now he was asking why his family had been part of its story all along. Ethan Caldwell remained inside the old house long after the sun had disappeared beneath the horizon. The photograph in his hands felt heavier than its size suggested. He had spent his entire life believing he knew his family's story. But now, standing inside a forgotten island home, he discovered a connection that had been hidden for decades. Ranger sat beside him quietly, sensing the importance of the moment. The German shepherd had always seemed to notice the things Ethan overlooked, but this discovery was different. This was not just another hidden room or forgotten object. This was a piece of Ethan's own history. The next morning, Ethan carefully studied the photograph again. The man standing beside Samuel Whitaker wore an old Marine uniform. His name was written on the back, followed by a date from many years earlier. Ethan recognized the last name immediately. It was the same family name he carried. He returned to the hidden compartment and searched for anything else connected to the photograph. Beneath the picture was a folded letter that had been carefully preserved. The handwriting was older, but the message was clear. The letter was written by Ethan's grandfather, a man he had only known through family stories. In the letter, his grandfather described the island as a place that changed his life. He wrote about arriving there after his military service and feeling uncertain about what came next. The island gave him time to heal, reflect, and reconnect with himself. Ethan read the words slowly because they felt familiar. He had experienced that same feeling after leaving the Marines. The challenge was not knowing how to serve. The challenge was discovering where that service belonged. The letter explained that Samuel had created the island community because he believed veterans needed more than recognition. They needed connection. They needed a place where they could talk, rest, and remember that their value did not disappear when their service ended. Ethan looked around the old house. The empty rooms suddenly felt different. They were not abandoned spaces. They were pieces of a mission that had been paused. Later that day, Ethan contacted a historian from the nearby town to learn more about his grandfather and the island's past. The historian was surprised when Ethan mentioned the photograph. She explained that many people had forgotten the island's original purpose. It was once known as a quiet place where veterans and families came together. But over time, the story faded, and the island became known only as a property nobody wanted. Ethan listened carefully. The island had not lost its value. People had simply forgotten how to see it. That evening, Ethan walked with Ranger toward the old garden. The German shepherd moved calmly beside him as they followed the same path they had discovered days earlier. Near the stone bench, Ethan noticed a small metal container hidden beneath a loose section of wood. Inside was a collection of handwritten names and dates. Some belonged to veterans. Others belonged to families who had visited the island. At the bottom of the page was a sentence written by Samuel. Every person who finds peace here becomes part of its story. Ethan stood silently for a moment. He finally understood why the island felt familiar. It was not because of the buildings or the memories stored inside them. It was because generations before him had searched for the same thing he was searching for now. A place to belong. A reason to continue. The following morning, Ethan returned to the main house and began making notes about what the island could become. He no longer saw himself as someone who had purchased forgotten land. He saw himself as someone who had been trusted with something meaningful. But before he could make plans for the future, he knew there was still more to discover. The old map, found inside Samuel's notebook, showed one final location on the island. A place marked only with a simple symbol. Ranger noticed Ethan looking at the map and walked toward the door. The German shepherd looked back, waiting. Ethan smiled softly and picked up the map. The island had already revealed its connection to his family. Now it was time to discover the final piece of its story. The old map from Samuel Whitaker's notebook rested on the wooden table inside the island house. Ethan Caldwell studied the faded lines carefully, following the path drawn across the northern side of the property. The symbol at the end of the map was simple, almost unfinished, but Ethan knew by now that the smallest details on the island often carried the deepest meaning. Ranger stood near the doorway, watching quietly as if he already knew another discovery was waiting. The German shepherd had been beside Ethan through every step of this journey, from the first hidden path to the forgotten rooms beneath the trees. Together, they followed the map through the quiet forest. The morning air was cool, and the sound of the ocean moved between the branches. The farther they walked, the more the island seemed to reveal its forgotten history. After nearly 30 minutes, they reached a clearing surrounded by tall trees. In the center was a small stone structure covered with moss. It was not a building. It was something much more personal. Ethan stepped closer and noticed several names carved carefully into the stone. These were not famous names. They were not people remembered in history books. They were ordinary people who had left a meaningful mark on the island. Beside the names was a small wooden box protected from the weather. Inside were handwritten letters, photographs, and notes from people who had visited the island over many years. Ethan opened the first letter and immediately recognized the style of writing from Samuel's journal. It explained the true purpose of this place. The island had always been a sanctuary for people searching for direction. It welcomed veterans returning from service, families rebuilding relationships, and individuals who needed a quiet place to begin again. Ethan read the words slowly. The message reminded him of something he had forgotten. A mission does not always end when the uniform is put away. Sometimes it simply changes form. Ranger sat beside him as he continued reading. The German Shepherd had become more than a companion during this journey. He had become a reminder to slow down and notice what mattered. Ethan looked at the names carved into the stone and imagined the people behind them. Their struggles, their hopes, their reasons for coming to this island. None of them came because life was perfect. They came because they needed a place where they could breathe and remember who they were. As the afternoon light moved across the clearing, Ethan discovered one final letter hidden beneath the photographs. It was written by Samuel near the end of his life. The letter explained that he knew the island would eventually become quiet. He knew time would change things, but he believed the right person would someday arrive and understand what the island truly represented. Ethan held the letter in his hands and felt the weight of those words. For years, he had believed he was searching for a peaceful place to disappear. But the island had shown him something different. He was not meant to disappear. He was meant to reconnect. That evening, Ethan returned to the old house with Ranger walking beside him. He placed the letters and photographs carefully on the table. The island no longer felt like a forgotten property. It felt like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The next day, Ethan began contacting people who could help him restore the island. He wanted to preserve the history while creating something meaningful for the future. He imagined veterans sitting together by the shoreline. He imagined families walking through the gardens. He imagined the empty rooms filled with voices again. For the first time since retiring, Ethan felt certain about what came next. But there was still one question he had not answered. If his family had been connected to the island for generations, why had nobody returned? As the sun lowered over the ocean, Ethan stood near the dock with Ranger beside him. He looked across the water toward the mainland and wondered what had caused everyone to leave. The island had revealed its heart. Now Ethan needed to understand its goodbye. The question about why everyone left the island stayed with Ethan Caldwell as he walked through the old house the next morning. The rooms were filled with memories, but there was still a missing piece of the story. He understood why the island mattered. He understood why people came there. But he did not understand why such a meaningful place had been forgotten for so many years. Ranger followed beside him as Ethan returned to the hidden room beneath the trees. The German Shepherd moved slowly through the familiar space, stopping near the shelves where Samuel Whitaker's belongings were stored. Ethan searched through the remaining journals and documents, hoping to find an answer. Near the bottom of an old wooden box, he discovered a sealed envelope marked with a date from 20 years earlier. The handwriting was different this time. It belonged to someone Ethan had never heard of before. Inside was a letter from Samuel's final caretaker. The letter explained what happened during the island's last years. The island did not disappear because people stopped believing in its purpose. It became quiet because the world around it changed. Travel became more difficult. The younger generation moved away. The people who understood the island's mission grew older. Slowly, the gatherings became smaller until one day, there was nobody left to continue them. Ethan read the letter carefully. There was sadness in the words, but there was also peace. The writer did not see the island as a failure. They saw it as a story waiting for a new chapter. The letter ended with a simple sentence. A place built on kindness is never truly empty. Ethan looked around the room and thought about his own life. After leaving the Marines, he had felt like his purpose had disappeared. He had spent years protecting others, but he never considered that service could continue in a different way. The island was teaching him the same lesson it had taught everyone before him. A person's mission does not end when circumstances change. It simply finds a new direction. Later that afternoon, Ethan walked toward the old dock with Ranger beside him. The wooden boards were weathered, but the structure still stood strong against the ocean breeze. Ethan imagined the people who once arrived there looking for peace. He imagined the conversations, the laughter, and the quiet moments that happened along the shoreline. The island had never been about the buildings. It had always been about the people. When Ethan returned to the house, he began making plans. He contacted local experts who could help preserve the historic structures. He reached out to veteran organizations and community leaders who believed in the same values Samuel had protected for decades. He did not want to change the island into something new. He wanted to help it become what it was always meant to be. Ranger stayed close during every step. The German Shepherd became a familiar sight around the property, walking beside Ethan as he inspected old paths and restored forgotten spaces. People who visited the island often noticed the connection between them. They saw how Ranger seemed to bring calm wherever he went. One evening, Ethan sat on the porch with Ranger resting near his feet. The ocean reflected the colors of the setting sun, and the island felt different from the place he had arrived at weeks earlier. It was no longer silent. It was simply waiting. Ethan looked toward the old buildings and realized something important. He had spent years searching for a place where he belonged. Somehow, he had found a place that needed him too. The following morning, while exploring the shoreline, Ranger suddenly stopped near the edge of the water. The German Shepherd looked toward a small area beneath the old dock. Ethan followed and discovered a weathered wooden box hidden between the supports. Inside was one final document. It was not another journal. It was a map. At the bottom was a note written in Samuel's handwriting. The island's future depends on the person who finds this. Ethan held the map quietly. He knew the island was not finished revealing its secrets, but now he understood something deeper. The discoveries were not leading him toward the past. They were preparing him for the future. The map found beneath the old dock remained on Ethan Caldwell's table for several days. He looked at it every morning with the same feeling he had when he first stepped onto the island. Curiosity, respect, and a quiet sense that something important was waiting to be completed. Ranger rested beside him as the ocean breeze moved through the open windows of the old house. The German Shepherd had been there from the beginning, noticing the small details that Ethan had overlooked. Now, together, they followed the final path marked on Samuel Whitaker's map. The location was not far from the main property. It led to a small hill overlooking the water, a place Ethan had passed many times without realizing its importance. At the top of the hill stood a simple wooden structure surrounded by wildflowers. Inside was a small room filled with letters, photographs, and records of everyone who had been part of the island's history. Ethan carefully opened each document, realizing this was not another secret meant to hide something. It was a reminder of everything the island had given to others. The final letter was from Samuel himself. He explained that he never wanted the island to be remembered because of its buildings or its beauty. He wanted it remembered because of the people who found hope there. Samuel wrote that every generation receives something from the people before them. Some receive money, some receive property, but the most meaningful gifts are the responsibilities we choose to carry. Ethan read those words several times. He finally understood the true reason the island had come into his life. It was never about escaping from the world. It was about returning to it with a renewed purpose. Over the following months, Ethan worked with the local community to restore the island. The old house became a welcoming place again. The gardens were carefully brought back to life. The forgotten paths became places where visitors could walk and reflect. Most importantly, the island became a place where veterans and families could gather once more. Ethan never wanted the island to become a symbol of wealth. He wanted it to remain a symbol of connection. Ranger became part of the island's new story. Visitors quickly noticed the calm presence of the German Shepherd who had helped uncover so many forgotten pieces of history. Children would sit beside him quietly. Veterans would smile when they saw him walking across the property with Ethan. Everyone seemed to understand that Ranger was more than just a dog. He was part of the reason the island's story had been rediscovered. One evening, Ethan stood near the shoreline where he had first arrived months earlier. The same waves moved across the water. The same trees surrounded the property, but everything felt different. He remembered how lonely the island had looked when he first saw it. Now, lights shone from the windows of the old house. Voices filled the rooms again. The place everyone once considered impossible to sell had become something far more valuable than anyone imagined. It had become a home. Ethan looked down at Ranger, who sat beside him watching the sunset. He smiled because he finally understood what the island had been trying to teach him. Sometimes people believe they are searching for a place to begin again. But sometimes, The place is the one searching for someone who can bring it back to life. Years later, people would still tell stories about the quiet island, the veteran who gave it a second chance, and the loyal German shepherd who discovered the truth hidden beneath years of silence. They would talk about the forgotten rooms, the old letters, and the promise that continued through a new generation. But the greatest discovery was never a secret room or a forgotten map. It was the reminder that kindness can survive time, that purpose can return when it seems lost, and that even the smallest act of loyalty can guide two souls toward where they truly belong. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Ethan walked back toward the house with Ranger beside him. The island was no longer waiting. It had finally found its caretaker.